guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and I'm kicking off this week's Ed Puzzle by talking about the politics of Reconstruction. So Reconstruction often refers to the time period immediately after the Civil War, starting in 1865. And ultimately, what we need to decide as a nation is how to handle the rebuilding of the South. How do we bring these states that have seceded back into the country? How do we treat ex-Confederate soldiers and generals? And what do we do to help the millions of freed slaves? Now, this time period is very politically contentious simply because there's no precedent for this. There is nothing in the Constitution regarding how to handle secession, how to handle a civil war. So each kind of politician or group of politicians during this time period had to kind of make it up as they went along. Now, we're going to start with Abraham Lincoln, who actually made his plans known for Reconstruction during the Civil War. And he believed that by publicizing his plans, it might help bring about a quicker end to the war itself. He believed in kind of a gentle hand, if you will, in that he wanted to bring rebellious states back into the Union. As long as 10% of its voting population took an oath of loyalty, and he wanted to make sure that these states also approved the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery. However, we will never know the full impact and weight of his plan because he was assassinated in April of 1865. But something else that was passed that was monumentally important to former slaves was the Freedmen's Bureau. And this was a government organization that provided food, medical assistance, and housing for former slaves. And on top of that, was responsible for establishing over 3,000 schools. Knowing the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be very important as we discuss Lincoln's successor, Vice President Andrew Johnson. So you'll notice that Andrew Johnson is a Democrat and Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And the reason he selected Andrew Johnson for his running mate in 1864 was that Andrew Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee. He is a Southerner, and he was one of the only Southern senators that was loyal to the Union, even though his home state of Tennessee was not. So as vice president, he was an unlikely president, and his plans for Reconstruction after Lincoln's assassination were fairly controversial. And during his presidency, he clashed quite a bit with the Republicans in Congress. So number one, he did want to punish wealthy landowners and did not want to give them back their property in the South. And many attribute this to the fact that he really struggled as a young man in Tennessee and was probably pretty envious of these wealthy planters and landowners. But he was fairly sympathetic, more sympathetic than Congress would have liked, to ex-Confederate leaders. And he did not bat an eye when many Southern states passed a series of laws known as Black Codes, which restricted the economic freedoms of former slaves. On top of that, he vetoed the rechartering of the Freedmen's Bureau and vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So Congress overrode his vetoes, and he was also opposed to the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship rights to former slaves. And here you have a very popular Thomas Nast cartoon of Andrew Johnson literally kicking the Freedmen's Bureau to the curb. But we know, again, that Congress overrode his veto. Now, these are two of his main adversaries in Congress, and these gentlemen, Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, are the leaders of a group known as Radical Republicans. So when you guys see the term Radical Republicans, what that means is these are, Lincoln Republicans who believed in full equality and civil rights for former slaves. And yes, this is the Charles Sumner who did have to take a 3-year hiatus after the caning incident, but he is back serving as senator from Massachusetts, along with Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania. And one of the things that the Radical Republicans are famous for is the impeachment trial, believe it or not, of Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson becomes the first president to be impeached. And I just want to reiterate here that impeachment is simply charges brought against a president, an investigation, and a trial. And it does not mean that a president is kicked out of office. Now, here's why Andrew Johnson was impeached. he was actually impeached because he defied a law that was known as the Tenure of Office Act. And the gentleman who was serving in the cabinet as Secretary of War was Edwin Stanton, who also served as Lincoln's Secretary of War. When Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, Congress said that the president could not basically kick people out of office without congressional approval. So they were trying to protect the Republicans serving in Johnson's cabinet. Johnson felt that this was unconstitutional and challenged it by suspending Secretary of War Stanton and appointing Ulysses S. Grant instead. Ulysses S. Grant wanted nothing to do with this, so he objected and resigned. And essentially, Stanton ended up barricading himself in his office, and it was a complete disaster. So Congress decides to bring 11 charges of misconduct against President Andrew Johnson. And obviously, the violation of this Tenure of Office Act was one of them. The impeachment trial lasted for 11 weeks. Then after 11 weeks, Congress was shy of one vote. So had they had one more vote, they would have convicted him and then possibly removed him from office. But because they were one vote short, he did stay in office. He was not obviously reelected, and Republican Ulysses S. Grant took office after Andrew Johnson. Everybody loves a war hero, and Grant was just that, even though he had no political experience. And under Ulysses S. Grant, one of the major things that happens is the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gives voting rights to former slaves. On top of that, you had these Reconstruction Acts of 1867 that were passed by the radical Republicans. And they were passed before the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, but I'm mentioning them here because what this did is this divided the South into 5 military districts, and it required that each Southern state pass the 14th Amendment. And it basically made sure that these Southern states were kind of falling in line and not mistreating former slaves. So this military occupation lasts throughout the rest of Johnson's presidency. It lasts throughout Grant's presidency. And I mention it here because it's important to note when it comes to the next presidential election. So in 1876, the Republicans ran Rutherford B. Hayes against Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Rutherford B. Hayes also fought in the Civil War, and he's from Ohio, which, as you can see here, is very much a swing state and still is today. And if you guys look at the map, you can tell that the popular vote was very close, and the electoral vote was even closer. And it was expected that most Southern states would vote for Democrats, but you'll notice that 3 states actually voted for the Republican candidate. So because that was not expected, there were calls of voter fraud and election fraud. And believe it or not, there was actually an investigation. And within this kind of election commission that was created, there was a compromise that was made. And the compromise was this. If the election was given to Rutherford B. Hayes, he would remove those military troops from the South and return power back to Southern Democrats, which were also known as the Redeemers, or, Southern Democrats that wanted to kind of restore the kind of old way of life back to the South. So he withdrew the troops, and the Southern Redeemers were back in power. And interestingly enough, even though this signals the official end of Reconstruction, many historians would argue that what happens in the South over the next 100 years is really kind of leftover damage from all of these decisions. You're going to see the rise of Black codes, Jim Crow laws, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and of course, this discrimination against African Americans, which will take place for the next 100 plus years. So Reconstruction, it can be argued that it was successful in some eyes and very unsuccessful in others. But I think it's really important to note that, again, a lot of the decisions made impact the South for the next 100 years. So I hope that kind of helped decipher a little bit of the politics, and I hope you guys have a great day.
Welcome back, 8-Pushers. Now, today's segment's going to be on the end of slavery. We'll see incredible gains for the rights of Black Americans after the Civil War ends. However, what's most alarming is the fact that rights, we can't take them for granted. Because after 1877, when Reconstruction ends, the amount of rights that are walked back and taken away is terrifying. So what progress was made? Let's go into that now, starting with the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1862, President Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation ready to go, but he didn't have the momentum he wanted in the war to issue it yet. So he was waiting for the tide of the war to turn in some way, shape, or form, and the closest thing to it would be the Battle of Antietam Creek, Sharpsburg, Maryland, that would do it. So Robert E. Lee and the Confederate forces would only try to invade Union territory 2 times, and spoilers, they will fail both times. The first of 2 will be at Antietam. This was the momentum that Lincoln was looking for. On September 17th, the Battle of Antietam is won. On September 22nd, Lincoln is going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So now this proclamation won't go into effect technically until January 1st, 1863. And the content of this proclamation said that any slaves in rebel territory, so in states that were in current rebellion, would be emancipated or freed. Now, technically, not a single slave was freed because the rebels were fighting a war over slavery and were about to let go of their slaves at this time. However, it did encourage and inspire slaves to escape to the North. Now, Lincoln was very strategic about not emancipating slaves in border territories. The reason why was early in the war, he wanted to keep Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland all loyal to the Union and not have second thoughts and defect to the Confederacy. Lincoln earns his nickname as the Great Emancipator as hundreds of thousands of slaves leave their plantations and escape to the North. An extra added benefit of the Emancipation Proclamation is that the British and French, especially the British, had considered supporting the South, the Confederacy, in this war. And the Trent Affair is a proof of that. However, the Emancipation Proclamation frees slaves in rebel territories, and it makes this war to some extent about slavery, and Britain does not want to be on the side of supporting slavery. This is kind of the watershed moment for them of deciding not to lend support to the South. The Militia Act of 1862 makes it legal for blacks to be part of the Union Army, and this Emancipation Proclamation that follows up January 1st, 1863, is now going to inspire blacks to escape to the North to join that army of freedom, and they do so in massive numbers. 180,000 black soldiers will fight in the Army of Freedom for the Union. That's 10% of the overall amount of soldiers that were fighting in this war for the Union, and 37,000 will die fighting in the name of freedom. Now, unfortunately, the Union Army remained segregated. They had all black regiments and all white regiments, and the all black regiments did have white officers. They were put in non-combat positions like supply line work, engineer work, cooking work, guard work, and typically did not get to see the glory of battle like white soldiers did. Now, a notable exception was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, led by a white officer, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. This all-black regiment did see action. The 54th will take the front lines in the charging of Fort Wagner on July 18th, 1863, and their bravery in battle will win them medals of honor. The war will end in April of 1865, but in January, Lincoln is sensing this coming to some degree and is realizing that he will have no easier time to try to pass an amendment to ban slavery than when the South is no longer actively participating in Congress. Lincoln was able to convince Congress to pass the 13th Amendment on January 31st, 1865. It was ratified December 6th, 1865, and officially abolishes slavery across the entire nation. Now, with 4 million former slaves or freedmen without homes, without jobs, without money, without education, without a variety of skill sets, how are they going to be able to transition to being freed men? Well, there's a Freedmen's Bureau, an agency that's created by the government in 1865 that will provide medical help, food, shelter, and even education to these former slaves, these freed men. One of the most impressive accomplishments of this bureau as having created nearly 3,000 schools that ended up educating nearly 200,000 people to read and write. The Bureau also helped settle labor disputes by supervising the writing of many labor contracts between freedmen and plantation owners. But with limited funding and growing opposition from even President Johnson himself, it faced constant challenges and ultimately ended in 1872. So this was a significant victory, but Southern states quickly responded with restrictive laws known as Black Codes. These were designed to suppress Black Americans economically, politically, and socially. State by state, they varied, but common laws included marriage restrictions, vagrancy laws, restrictions on property ownership, curfews, prohibition on assembling, like getting together and gathering in large groups, limitations on education, restrictions on movement, discriminatory licenses for businesses. A lot of different restrictions were being put on Black Americans at this time. In the Louisiana Black Code here and the Mississippi Black Code provided, you could see specific sections and some of the examples of what they would prohibit. Freedmen were constantly deprived of their natural rights, so it became time to fight for laws to protect them. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 will be the first legislation to try to ensure that all of these freedmen are considered citizens and that they are deserving of the rights of citizens. Now, since it's just an act, it's easy for this to be overturned once Southern states start returning to the Union. Something more permanent would be an amendment. And that's the idea behind getting the 14th Amendment passed. It states that anyone born here is a citizen, so that means all of these former slaves who were born here into servitude are in fact citizens, and it promises equal protection of the law. The effect of this amendment over time cannot be understated because it will be the bedrock of cases like Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which will turn the tide of the modern civil rights fight. Northern congressmen were able to pass the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, and in this Reconstruction Act, it divided up the South into 5 districts and placed Northern generals in charge of essentially supervising these districts and making sure that the peace is kept and freedmen are, in fact, being given their rights. Building on these reforms, Congress passed the 15th Amendment February 26, 1869. It was ratified February 3rd, 1870. It ensured that citizens could not be denied the right to vote based on race, color, or previous servitude. So this will split the women's suffrage movement. The National Women's Suffrage Association was not happy about this. This included people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they will protest against the 15th Amendment even passing and being ratified due to the fact that it's unfair to women. Susan B. Anthony will even famously in 1872 vote in the presidential election, get arrested, and then go on trial, get convicted, and make a statement about how wrong this is. However, ASA, American Women's Suffrage Association, will support the 15th Amendment, saying that it is an incremental step in the right direction, and ultimately women will get the right to vote. But this was the next step in the process and is still a victory to some degree for suffrage overall. The Enforcement Acts passed by Congress and signed by President Grant in 1870 and 1871 were also attempts to try to protect Black Americans from voter discrimination and KKK activities. Despite these challenges, Black political representation surged during Reconstruction, with the 15th Amendment opening the vote to Black male citizens and Section 3 of the 14th Amendment barring any previous office holders who had supported the Confederacy from running. This opened up opportunities for Black congressmen to run in their positions. By 1870, the first Black congressman, Joseph Rainey of South Carolina, was elected to the House of Representatives. The first Black senator would be Hiram Revels, who took Jefferson Davis's place in Mississippi. This is even more monumental because Jefferson Davis had been the Confederacy's president during the war. Blanche K. Bruce of Mississippi became the first Black senator to serve a full term, as Hiram had only served 1 year. Throughout the next decade, 16 Black men served in Congress, 14 in the House and 2 in the Senate. More than 2,000 Black office holders served in nearly every level of government during Reconstruction. Most of these congressmen came from southern states with large Black populations like South Carolina and Mississippi. In fact, South Carolina's House delegation was majority Black for a time in the 1870s. They performed exceptionally well, but this progress was short-lived. By 1901, due to discriminatory practices and the rise of Jim Crow laws, the last black congressman of the era, George Henry White of North Carolina, left office. Black representation in Congress effectively disappeared for decades. The next black congressman was Oscar Stanton DePriest, who wouldn't be elected into the House of Representatives until 1928 for Illinois. For the Senate, no black American would be elected until Edward Brooke in 1966. Now that's going to be all for this segment on the end of slavery. However, you're about to hear about sharecropping, essentially slavery by another name. Have a great rest of the day.
Hi, everyone. It's Miss Ulrich here. I'm here to talk to you about what life was like for Blacks after the Civil War. Remember, after the Civil War, at least on paper, Blacks' lives were supposed to get dramatically better. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment, granting Black citizenship, and the 15th Amendment giving Blacks the right to vote, it looked like things would be a whole lot better. But as we're going to see from the following slides, that was not necessarily the case. As the Black codes got erased around the 1880s, which was mentioned in another video today, they were replaced with what were called Jim Crow laws. And these were meant to segregate or separate Blacks from whites, continually trying to make them feel inferior. Jim Crow is not a real person. It was just named after a minstrel show that portrayed Blacks in a very demeaning light. And so these Jim Crow laws that segregated Blacks from whites spread across the South predominantly, although the North was not immune from Jim Crow laws, but they were predominantly in the South. So you might see separate drinking fountains like we see here, separate waiting rooms, separate seats on a public bus, separate railroad cars, separate hospitals, separate prisons, all sorts of different ones. Here you can see separate movie theaters, separate hotels. I personally think the craziest Jim Crow law was in one place. They said that the Black and white students' textbooks could not be housed in the same facility. Even the textbooks of the kids had to be separated. As you can see in the lower right, schools were also segregated as a result of these Jim Crow laws. And it wasn't just separated facilities. As you can tell from these pictures, the Blacks' facilities were far, far worse off than the whites. For instance, white schools received 10 times as much funding as Black kids' schools. Think about the ramifications of this. If this was going on in the 1880s and continued for the next 60 years, which it will, it's going to have a huge impact on how educated Blacks can get, how much success they can get in terms of jobs after schooling. Plessy versus Ferguson was a monumental Supreme Court decision passed in decided in 1896, started because a Black man was trying to sit in a white train car, and that violated these Jim Crow laws. And ultimately, the Supreme Court rules in this decision, the whole notion of separate but equal was okay. And this is basically legalizing Jim Crow laws. Like I said, these are going to be on the books, these segregated everything, separated lunch counters and restaurants. Like I said, so many different aspects. These are going to be on the books now and allowed for the next, 50, 60 years. So a very important Supreme Court decision. Unfortunately, what's going to happen is not only are they going to be segregated facilities, but the whole separate but equal, the equal part is not going to be followed. And so, like I said, like with the schools, Black schools are going to get way less funding. Let's talk about politically. Remember, the 15th Amendment gave Blacks the right to vote. So as a result, as you can see here, they voted in large numbers. Many whites had to declare a loyalty oath after the Civil War, and some refused to do that. So they were at first ineligible to vote. As a result, we see our first Black politicians in Congress. And you can see the numbers here that there are definitely a lot more Blacks that than previously the whites were used to. And so unfortunately, some whites that were used to having more power politically were not okay with that. And so different measures are going to be passed to try to bring the South back to the way that it was before in terms of having blacks not have a voice politically. One way to do that was through the poll tax. This was implemented in which it required people to pay a tax to vote. Obviously, we do not have that today. You don't need money to vote, but this is what was passed at the time to try to keep blacks from voting. It was the equivalent of several days' pay, which might not sound like a big deal, but remember, as mentioned in another video, blacks, many of them are stuck in the South sharecropping, dependent upon whites, and are not able to economically break free. And so paying a poll tax was actually going to be a big burden. Eventually, this will get abolished with the passage of an amendment in the 1960s. Another thing, though, that was done was the literacy test. This is testing blacks' ability to technically read and write, but it was used in a manipulative way to try to keep blacks from voting. So they'd have to read a passage from the U.S. Constitution and write it, and then answer a series of questions. And this was administered to whites too, but if it was administered to blacks, they were often given way harder questions with way harder parameters in order to pass it. So it was really, really difficult questions versus if you were a white person taking a literacy test, you might just have to get one question right and it'd be a lot easier question. So this was also used to keep blacks from politically having a say. There was something called the grandfather clause passed to try to help those poor whites that were maybe uneducated and could not pass the literacy test. This was grandfathering them in by basically saying, as long as your grandfather voted before 1867, then you could vote. And remember, blacks could not vote prior to that. So it was a way to kind of safeguard those whites that had been not able to vote because of the poll tax or literacy test. Remember, the literacy test is especially so hard for blacks, as we mentioned with the Jim Crow laws. They are in segregated and way, way, way worse off schools. So this was really, really hard. And this, unfortunately, is going to be successful at keeping many blacks from voting. On top of that, the Ku Klux Klan is formed after the Civil War. It is formed in Tennessee. A group of ex-Confederate soldiers are unhappy with the outcome of the Civil War, and they're going to be led by this guy up here, Nathan Bedford Forrest. He will be the Grand Wizard of the KKK, and it soon spreads to all of the other states. They include in their ranks mayors, sheriffs, all sorts of law enforcement officers. And you just never knew who was a member of the Klan or not. They wore these white robes and they hid their identity. So it was very intimidating because you didn't know who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. What they would do is their primary objective was to intimidate blacks from voting. So it might be burning their churches and schools, because those were places where blacks would try to be educated or at least organize themselves. They'd go after blacks by murdering them and lynching them, or whites too that were helping them. So carpetbaggers or scalawags, these white Republicans that were trying to help the blacks get the right to vote, they might meet this fate. And lynchings, like I mentioned, these were unjustified mob ruling, taking actions in their own hands and hanging people, not because they were found guilty of anything. This is going to dramatically increase, specifically trying to intimidate blacks. The KKK utilizes this technique to try to stop blacks from voting. And unfortunately, it is quite successful, understandably so. It would be incredibly intimidating to try to exercise that right to vote if you were black at this time. And as you can see, look at what ends up happening. In 1890, 55% of the Selma, Alabama residents were black, and only 1% of them were voters. Similar situation in Birmingham, Alabama. So unfortunately, as we mentioned, on paper, blacks' lives looked to be getting dramatically better after the Civil War. But thanks to Jim Crow laws, the rise of the KKK, and these other political tactics like poll taxes and literacy tests, it is going to be far from equal, to say the least. Thanks, guys.
Hey everyone. So the Civil War had a huge impact on the development of the United States in the second half of the 20th century. Today we are going to talk about the ways in which the war and Reconstruction, which occurred after, shaped the economy. In the years following the Civil War, the economy of the United States would go through a dramatic transformation known as the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution would shift America from an agricultural society to one that was fully industrialized. The Civil War was the catalyst for much of this industrialization. It can be viewed as an economic turning point in our nation's history. So, mobilizing for the Civil War was a massive undertaking that in many ways stimulated the Northern economy. The North had a significant economic advantage at the start of the Civil War. Not only did the North control most of the nation's wealth, but they also had a larger population, thousands of more miles of railroad track, and significantly more manufacturing. After the first shots at Fort Sumter, the North began to bring these financial resources to bear against the Confederacy. With the Southern states no longer in the Union, Northern Republicans in Congress were able to pass a number of new laws that were designed to stimulate industry and help finance the war. The first law was the Morrill Tariff Act, which increased tariff rates to protect American industry and raise funds for the war effort. Additionally, the government established a new national banking system to finance the war. The National Banking Act helped to pay for the war by selling bonds and establishing a standard paper currency throughout the North. More importantly, though, the national banking system was the most important banking legislation passed by the federal government since the Second National Bank in the 1830s. The creation of a national banking system would provide a financial infrastructure that was heavily needed in order to grow big businesses after the war. The Civil War significantly improved the infrastructure in the North by expanding the railroad system as well. In 1861, the North had about 22,000 miles of railroad tracks. These railroads played a pivotal role in the victory of the Northern armies during the Civil War. The railroad allowed the North to quickly transport goods, artillery, and men, and it helped the Union strategically deploy their resources against the South. For a nation that was torn apart by war, many Northerners saw railroads as a way of tying the nation together. Republicans in Congress pursued this policy of unification through railroads by passing the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. The Pacific Railway Act helped fund the building of a transcontinental railroad to help link the East and the West. The government funded the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad by using land grants to railroad companies, and by 1869, the project was completed. This feat would help the North and the West linked together, making valuable Western resources available to help stimulate the economy and industrial production. The Northern economy also benefited from increased agricultural production in the West during the Civil War. The Civil War demanded massive food production to feed the Union Army. Over 250,000 mechanical reapers helped turn farmlands in the North and West into commercial agricultural producers. The corn and wheat fields of the North were able to produce so much surplus grain that by the end of the war, Northern agricultural products overtook King cotton as a major export. To further stimulate Western settlement and the expansion of farming on the Great Plains, the federal government passed the Homestead Act in 1862. The Homestead Act gave settlers 160 acres of land out west for little to no money, and it promoted westward migration and the development of the farming frontier in the years following the Civil War. Factory production also increased for the North during the Civil War. Northern factories introduced new labor-saving machinery, which allowed them to increase production even as many workers were called off to fight. For example, the North was able to fabricate a large number of uniforms and shoes for the Army with the help of the sewing machine. Isaac Singer patented his sewing machine in 1850, and by 1863, at the height of the Civil War, Singer was selling 20,000 sewing machines each year. All of these changes increased the prosperity of the North. By 1870, the North controlled 88% of the nation's wealth. The Civil War gave birth to the first millionaire class in American history. These individuals would dominate the American economy in the years following the Civil War. Of course, if the Civil War improved the fortunes of the North, it also had the opposite effect on the South. Prior to the Civil War, the Southern economy had been built on King cotton, which was the single largest American export before the war had begun. The South had felt that King cotton would help them win the war, and they were hoping Great Britain's reliance on cotton for their textile mills would persuade them to provide aid to the Confederacy. However, King cotton failed them. Part of the reason for this was that the South was a victim of their own success. The South had produced so much cotton in the 1850s that European countries like Great Britain had large cotton surpluses stored in their warehouses. By the time Great Britain's cotton supply began to dwindle, they were able to find new suppliers such as Egypt and India. Cotton was never again to drive the American economy. The Civil War had replaced cotton capitalism with industrial capitalism. The South had other issues at the end of the Civil War as well. Most of the fighting of the Civil War had occurred in the South and had left large parts of the South completely destroyed. Rebuilding the South became one of the major goals of Reconstruction. However, by far the most pressing issue involved the 4 million slaves who had been freed by the war. How would these slaves be integrated into the economy given the very nature of the institution of slavery, which had denied them education, land, and personal savings? At first, it looked like the North was going to take steps to issue former slaves land so that they could achieve economic independence. During the Civil War, General Sherman issued Special Field Order 15 in January of 1865, which set aside large tracts of land in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The federal government had confiscated over 400,000 acres of land from Southerners during the actual war. The government began to distribute this land to former slaves. Each former slave was given 40 acres, and over 40,000 slaves took advantage of this opportunity. The military later decreed that the army would lend many of these new settlers mules, which gave rise to the famous slogan that former slaves were promised 40 acres and a mule. Sherman's policy was reinforced by the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865. The Freedmen's Bureau, under the leadership of Oliver Howard, rented out land to former slaves with the intent that they would be able to buy that land within 3 years. However, the redistribution of Confederate lands to former slaves soon ran into trouble in the form of President Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson was very lenient when it came to his Reconstruction plan for the South, which granted amnesty to many former Confederates. Johnson personally pardoned many of the top officials of the Confederacy, as well as some of the wealthiest Southern plantation owners. These pardons reestablished the rights of former Confederates. And in September of 1865, President Johnson ordered Oliver Howard and the Freedmen's Bureau to give back all the land to its original owners. This had a devastating effect on the freedmen. Howard was forced to take back the lands that had been distributed by the federal government, leaving many freedmen with very few economic opportunities. This represented the single greatest failure of the federal government during Reconstruction, because the government never seriously addressed the economic needs of former slaves. With no land, many freed slaves found themselves ensnared in an economic system that in many ways looked remarkably similar to slavery: sharecropping. Lacking savings and formal education, many freedmen became tenant farmers, working someone else's land. Sharecropping forced both white and black farmers to rent land and housing from a landowner. They would sign sharecropping contracts, which paid the landowner about 1/2 to 1/3 of their crops. The landowners would set the prices of the harvest, as well as loan the sharecroppers tools and seeds, with interest, of course. So the combination of these loans, coupled with the falling prices of cotton after the Civil War, ensured that sharecroppers were constantly in debt and essentially became tied to someone else's land. This cycle of poverty would greatly limit the economic opportunities for African Americans in the years following the Civil War. For many African Americans in the South, education was the key to improving their economic position. The Freedmen's Bureau had successfully opened up public schools and communities across the South during Reconstruction, and it is responsible for teaching roughly 200,000 African Americans how to read and write. Several black colleges were formed throughout this period as well, including Howard University and Fisk University. However, by far the most famous school created during this time period was the Tuskegee Institute, founded in 1881. The Tuskegee Institute was led by Black civil rights leader Booker T. Washington and was an important vocational school that specialized in teaching students agricultural and industrial skills. Booker T. Washington viewed vocational skills and economic independence as the most important steps towards racial equality in the United States and the best way for African Americans to fight back against the rise of Jim Crow laws in the South following the end of Reconstruction. The Tuskegee Institute was instrumental in training teachers to work in rural areas of the South, greatly expanding access to education for many African Americans. So the era of Reconstruction reshaped all parts of the Southern economy, just like it did the North. As Northern armies left the South after 1877, a new South emerged, which was economically more diverse than the old Cotton Kingdom. Journalists such as Henry Grady promoted this idea of a new South in order to attract new businesses and investors to the region. Indeed, economic progress had been made by the South in the years following the Civil War. As the North shifted their industrial production to heavy industries such as steel and oil, the South began to industrialize more as well. and Southern factories took the place of New England as the center of textile production in the United States. Additionally, the South improved its infrastructure by rapidly expanding their railroad network in the years following the war. On the whole, however, the South remained largely agricultural and tied to the production of cotton. The South after the Civil War was by far the poorest section of the American economy, with an average Southerner earning about 2/5 of their Northern counterparts. The continued reliance on sharecropping would keep both black and white farmers in a state of perpetual poverty, and the growth of Jim Crow laws would continue to limit economic opportunities for African Americans. These issues would continue to shape American life well into the 20th century. Take care.